Hey everyone, it's Luke Johnson and Jennifer Avery, and we are doing a brand new book. What book are we doing, Jennifer?
We are doing Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. This is the basis of every romantic comedy you have ever seen in your life. It quite simply is.
So, you and I have not really talked extensively about how we want to run this seminar. We're going to try to break this up to like 5 or 6 sessions, whatever it requires. I really had 2 things that I wanted to accomplish today. And we can talk about the order that we want to do these in. All right. The first is I believe we should give a synopsis, an overview of the text, like its general contours quickly, to do that quickly. And then secondly, why ought we to care about this book? In full disclosure, it took 3 readings for me to really start to enjoy this. And the third time it clicked. But something that I would like to communicate to the audience today is why you believe this book is so important outside of the fact that so many other books are built upon it. So you can, whatever way you want to address these questions, you can do the synopsis first or the importance thing first, whichever you want to do. But those are the 2 things I hope to get out of our introduction to Austen's Pride and Prejudice.
Okay. Well, a quick synopsis. The Bennet family is a gentry, landed gentry family, but they don't have a whole lot of money. Mr. Bennet's estate is entailed away. That means that it's going to be when he dies, is going to a more distant relation, because he only has daughters. Now this society was all patriarchal. The men inherited from men. Women did not inherit anything. And so the estate is entailed away to this distant relation, and therefore the daughters, there are 5 daughters in this family. It's extremely important for these daughters to marry well. That means to marry somebody who has money so that the rest of the family can be taken care of. And so they won't end up destitute. Like if they ended up old maids, then they would be completely out of luck. So in any case, along comes Mr. Bingley, who is somebody who is letting a house in the neighborhood, and this house and Netherfield Park, and every single woman and their mother is pouncing on this guy because he makes a decent amount of money. He's from a good family. Okay, so Bingley brings along his sisters and his very good friend, Mr. Darcy, and Mr. Darcy is an even more important person. He makes more money, and his family is even older.
Mr. Darcy.
Yeah, Mr. Darcy. But in any case, all of the sisters meet Bingley and Darcy and his 2 and Bingley's 2 sisters, it becomes obvious that Jane, the oldest Bennet daughter, and Mr. Bingley are interested in each other. And Mr. Darcy is regarded as a very proud, unlikable person, and so there are several meetings with these people, and through these meetings you begin to see more of their characters, and a lot of stuff happens. Once everybody is pretty sure that Mr. Bingley and Jane are going to get married, Mr. Bingley runs off to London and says that and his sister says that he may never come back to the house that he rented in the neighborhood, and so Jane basically has to give up on him, and so that really brings everybody down. But Elizabeth goes, well, first of all, a cousin comes along and tries to marry Elizabeth, and Elizabeth won't have him, and her mother is very angry about that. But he ends up marrying her friend Charlotte Lucas, and so Elizabeth goes and visits Mr. Collins and Charlotte Lucas, and there she sees Mr. Darcy, who, unbeknownst to her, but known to the reader, Mr. Darcy's kind of got a little bit of a thing for Lizzie. And so while she's visiting her friend Charlotte and her new husband, Mr. Darcy actually asks her to marry him, and she refuses him. And later on, because she doesn't like him, basically. And so we go along a little while, and and we still haven't heard from Bingley, and Lizzie's still mad at Darcy, and all this is going on. But then we discover that some things that Elizabeth has been led to believe about Darcy are not true. And so she begins to think of him a little bit differently, just in time for her to go to Derbyshire with her aunt and uncle. And there they stop at Pemberley. And back in those days, even if someone owned a great house like this, a great mansion kind of place, or a castle, you could still tour it. And so they tour Pemberley, which is Mr. Darcy's house. And while they're touring Pemberley, they run into Mr. Darcy, and Lizzie and Mr. Darcy begin to actually she begins to actually like him. And so she's changed her mind about him a little bit. But while they are in Derbyshire, they discover that Lizzie's youngest sister Lydia has run off with a captain, or not a captain, or a soldier, and is a very inappropriate match. It was somebody who had wronged Mr. Darcy. Mr. Wickham had wronged Mr. Darcy in the past, and now he's gone off to London with Elizabeth's younger sister. And this creates an enormous scandal because they have not gotten married, but they are living together in London. Back in those days, that was social suicide. You did not do that. It was no, no, no. There was no living in sin. And there's a lot of trouble with that. But then suddenly Lydia and Mr. Wickham get married, and we find out later that Mr. Darcy is the one who made it happen. And so Mr. Bingley comes back, Mr. Darcy comes back. Bingley asks Jane to marry him, and Darcy asks Lizzie to marry him again, and they both get married, and everybody lives happily ever after. There's your synopsis.
That was very good. That was very good. I know I put a lot of pressure on you right there.
It's hard to put what is it, 400 pages. Okay, but so why should we care about this book?
All right, so Channel, here's what I want to say. I think it is very easy, at least from grizzled 37-year-old dude perspective, to see it as kind of a, this is probably not going to sound very PC, but or refined, but
it's a chick book.
It seems like kind of gossipy and kind of silly in some ways. But then as time went on, as I went deeper and deeper into it, I got to see that there was a complexity to the characters, and I realized there's more to meets the eye.
Exactly.
So a lot of what this seminar is going to be about with you and me is trying to unearth some of the more meaningful themes that are in the text. So if you met, so how would you respond to that criticism?
Well, and you actually touched on it just there, because what is so important about this book is not necessarily the plot, although, as I mentioned, it is the basis of every romantic comedy that's ever been made or written. It's the scenario of they hate each other. One of them starts to like the other one, and they start liking each other, and they end up together. That's what I'm talking about. That's not what's important, though, even though it is very fundamental in our culture today. What's important is the characterization, the interpersonal relationships between the characters, the personalities of the characters are all extremely vivid. And one of the reasons that we have such a pure picture of the Regency era of England is because of Jane Austen and her books and the way that their society operated. She gets into the tiny little details about what was important back in those days. And additionally, there is a touch of feminism in this. Again, it's not going to be apparent to a modern person, to a modern woman in particular, because she's still, it's not the way things are now. But there is a touch of feminism here because Lizzie is a very intelligent person. She's very witty. She does her own thing. She doesn't let other people's opinions affect hers, or society affect her opinion of things. And so there's a little bit of feminism there, not as much as say Jane Eyre, but there
That
is.
was going to be the thing I was going to ask you. Do you see a pretty strong corollary between Lizzie and Jane?
Not at all, actually, not much at all, because Lizzie is this. She's very much a gentle woman, whereas Jane was kind of an oddity. She was a little bit of an anomaly, but Lizzie is very appropriate, very proper. She would have had, although she was more intelligent and could, sketch characters like Jane could. That's one way. That's probably the place where they're the most similar, is where they understood people. They understand people and what their motivations are. But Lizzie is a little bit more proper, I suppose you should say. I should say. She was higher ranking in society. She's a gentleman's daughter, and she's not an orphan. And so, yeah, I don't see a very strong correlation between the two. I don't see it.
Well, I was going to say, it's not just that they would have in common. There seems to be this dance between Lizzie and Mr. Darcy, and then Jane and Mr. Rochester.
Yeah, well, there is a little bit of difference there, but the difference there is that Jane, despite Rochester's kind of abrasive personality, Jane appreciates that about him. Whereas Darcy's arrogant, prideful personality is abrasive to Lizzie. Yeah. And so again, Jane immediately likes Mr. Rochester. Lizzie does not immediately like Darcy. And so, yeah.
Yeah, so that's an important difference to bring out, and which raises this question, right? Is that, Charlotte Bronte and Jane Austen are oftentimes mentioned in the same breath. So what does this novel do that Jane Eyre did not do? How do these novels enter into conversation with one another? What fix do they give us intellectually?
Well, that they're often mentioned together because, number one, because they take place in very similar time periods. Although Charlotte Bronte was later than Jane Austen, we were still actually, with Charlotte Bronte, we were entering into the Victorian era in England, and out of the Regency era or the Georgian period. But the rules of society were very much the same. Although things were changing very gradually, they were very much the same. And that's part of why they're mentioned together. And they're also mentioned together because they're both female authors, and that was unusual back then. And because they're also novels of this, they're also novels of personality. There's a lot of characterization in them that is just flawless. Like the characters come out at you from the page. They sound like real people. In both novels, all the characters sound like real people. And that's probably why they're that's probably why they're mentioned at the same time for the most part.
But there's a chasm. But there's a chasm, right? These are very different kinds of books. And
Yes.
how would you elaborate upon the difference between?
The difference between them is, again, Lizzie is Pride and Prejudice is more of a comedy, and Jane Eyre is more of a drama. Because and that they it's called Pride and Prejudice is often referred to as a comedy of manners, whereas Jane Eyre was a novel of the self. So although we do have a very clear picture of Lizzie and we do get some of her introspection, it's nothing compared to the level of introspection you get with Jane Eyre. And also the characters are vastly different. Lizzie is this bright, happy, witty, sociable girl, and Jane is kind of this odd, quiet, kind of mousy little governess. And although Jane has a fire in her, like Lizzie does, Jane's fire is very much concealed, whereas Lizzie's is not so much. And so that's just a few of the reasons that they are different. A few of the things that make them different is the characters themselves, like I said, and just the overall tone of the novel. So there's that.
So maybe you could say a little bit of something about how you wanted to develop this seminar series. Like, is it going to be a character study? Is that how, or how did you kind of imagine things unfolding?
I was just going to kind of cover it, really. I used to be a teacher, and I don't know, maybe I'm out of practice, but yeah, the main thing that I want to focus on as far as Pride and Prejudice is this characterization and the play between the characters, the interpersonal relationships between the characters and how they perceive each other. And also, one of the absolute best conversations in the literature is in this book. Because I could actually see this conversation taking place, and it's just it seems kind of random, but it's an ingenious way to reveal characters through this conversation, and again, that's another reason why Pride and Prejudice is considered a masterpiece, is because of these characterizations and some of these conversations that take place that are just that make the characters so vivid. And it's really brilliantly done. Like there are very few writers who can capture what's true about people, or the relationships between people. And Jane Austen is one of them. And so that's why she's so important.
So before we start breaking it all down, are there any personal reasons that are separable from the ones that you've already given for why you love this book so much?
This is actually not my favorite Jane Austen book, and it's probably actually my third or fourth favorite that I've read.
But that doesn't mean you don't hold it in high regard. You certainly do.
I do hold it in high regard, though, because it's mainly because again, I'm a writer, and one of the things that I really strive to do is to develop characters that you can see, and characters that you can understand, and you can read about them and say, I know somebody like that, or I can see this person walking into the room, and the writers got it down, because I really admire that. And the dialogue is an important thing for me as well. And the dialogue is just so, it's remarkable. To me, it is because like I said, these are conversations that you could actually see taking place. And where in the world did she come up with this? Like maybe she had a conversation with somebody about these things, but it's just it's just brilliantly done, and it's well written, and it's got this great little tongue-in-cheek tone to it, and so it's extremely entertaining.
How much do you believe Jane Austen put of herself into this book?
I think there's a lot of her in this book. I haven't researched as much as I should into Jane Austen herself, but she would have been around, she would have been around this sort of behavior. She would have been in this society, and basically she wrote what she knew. She wrote what she observed, and she did it in this way that made it timeless. Um, and so I think there's a lot I think that Lizzie is a lot like Jane Austen, although from what I understand, Jane Austen was a little bit quieter maybe than Lizzie, a little bit more solemn. I don't know, but I think maybe Lizzie is a version of her.
So can you disclose like where this ranks in your hierarchy and within the subgroup of Jane Austen novels and why you put it there?
Let me see. So I'm looking at my Austen books now. It's Persuasion is my favorite. The only ones I haven't read are Emma and Mansfield Park, but Persuasion is my favorite. And probably this is going to be number 3 behind Northanger Abbey, because I like and I like just the humor of Northanger Abbey and the satire of Northanger Abbey. It's above Sense and Sensibility though, because the characters are more likable in Pride and Prejudice. I have a great admiration for Eleanor in a Sense and Sensibility, but Mary Ann gets on my nerves. And so I love Jane and Lizzie in Pride and Prejudice, and I think Mr. Darcy is a better hero, although he is not any better than Captain Wentworth or Colonel Brandon for that matter. Oh. But Darcy is a good hero, and he's a good hero for Lizzie, which is why it's a good thing. This is why it works. It's because she matches her heroes and heroines very well with each other. Like I said, Darcy's not my favorite. A lot of women will say, "Oh, I love Mr. Darcy," but only because of Colin Firth.
Well, that leads to my next question. So my next question is, there have been so many artistic interpretations of this book. Can you, and I imagine that a lot of people who would be taking advantage of these teaching resources would also be looking into those to help complement their understanding of the novel. Can you recommend like certain productions, certain plays, certain movies of this that you find to be superior than others?
My favorite version of Pride and Prejudice, as far as the movie version, is the one with Colin Firth and Jennifer L. It's an A&E production, I believe, and I believe it was in the early to mid '90s where it was put out, and it's usually a 2-volume set. I like that one because it's fairly accurate. And they don't leave out the stuff that's that they include everything that's important, and they leave out things that they just basically cherry picked the dialogue well, and plus the actors did a very good job with the characters. There was and I like that one the best. There's also a BBC version of it that was probably done in the late 70s, early 80s that I like, but Mr. Darcy was not very good, and Lizzie was a little bit annoying. But in that one, that my favorite conversation is the book is in that one. Whereas it is not in the Colin Firth version. And so that pleased me to see it. And so those two are the ones I would recommend the most.
Yeah, I'm looking at it here. It was the one that you liked the most with Jennifer L. and Colin Firth. Came out in 1995.
Yeah.
And it won a Primetime Emmy.
And it would. It was very well done.
Yeah. It's about 5.5 hours. Cool. All right. So why don't we just kind of jump into it? Do what you want to do.
All right, cool. Well, I'm going to try to get through chapter 9 today. And the first few chapters are really just setting up the characters and the situations and everything like that. So I do want to take a minute to spend on the opening line of the book. This is considered one of the best and most effective opening lines ever written in the English language. And it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of someone or other of their daughters. And the reason why this line is number one is it's just constructed brilliantly. It's funny, and also because it completely summarizes the book in very few sentences. So we have the whole thing right here in this first couple of lines. So we know what this book is about. Okay, but in the first chapter, we find out from Mr. and Mrs. Bennet that a new young man named Mr. Bingley has moved into their neighborhood, and he is letting a house. That means he's renting it. And this actually did happen a lot in those days. Some people, like great families in particular, who may have been an older family but had lost some money over the years, would sometimes rent out their estate, their manor homes, to other people who had more money. And so that's what Mr. Bingley has done here. Okay, and we have this conversation between Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet, and right away you get a sense of their characters. Mr. Bennet kind of likes to tease Mrs. Bennet, and let me see.
How would you describe that relationship? Because it seems like it's not all.
Yeah, she lays it out pretty clearly. Mr. Bennet is a very intelligent man. He's very witty, and he's kind of sardonic.
He's pretty woke. He's woke.
Huh? I'm sorry. Yeah, he's
woke.
Yeah, he's woke. He's definitely woke. And he's got this kind of dry, sardonic sense of humor. But his wife, Mrs. Bennet, she's kind of dumb. She doesn't understand half of what he says, and she half the time she doesn't realize that he's messing with her. And so basically, Mr. Bennet's main source of entertainment is messing with his wife. And she's actually kind of ridiculous, as we'll see later on. And she's even later, like a little bit later on, you begin to see that Mrs. Bennet is even kind of vulgar in terms of society in those days. She's a little bit too, she talks a little bit too much about things she shouldn't talk about. And but in any case, right here in 2 paragraphs, we get just the perfect illustration of their dynamic. He says, she says, I see no occasion for that. He says, you and the girls may go. And they're talking about going to see Mr. Bennet. Back in, the man, when a new person came into the neighborhood, the man would go and visit them and meet them first. And then later on, the other man would return the call. And then maybe they might be introduced to the rest of the family. And so Mrs. Bennet is trying to get Mr. Bennet to go and visit Mr. Bingley because he's a single man and she's got 5 daughters. And she says, and he says, you and the girls may go, or you may send them by themselves, which perhaps will be still better. Whereas you are as handsome as any of them, Mr. Bingley might like you the best of the party. My dear, you flatter me. I certainly have my share of beauty, but I do not pretend to be anything extraordinary now. When a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought to give over thinking of her own beauty. In such cases, a woman has not often much beauty to think of. So that's Mr. Bennet and Miss Bennet, and you can see he's messing with her, but she doesn't realize it. And you get the sense of how vain Mrs. Bennet is and how obsessed she is with getting her daughters married off.
Is it just a financial thing that drives her obsession with getting them married off? Is there something more at play here?
I think first of all, it's a financial concern because the longer the girls stay at home, the more money Mr. Bennet loses because they have to be those girls have to be clothed, they have to be fed, and all of these things. And so an old like later on, Charlotte Lucas will talk about she's already a burden to her parents. And back in those days, the women did become a financial burden if they didn't marry. And so it was a financial concern, but also I think it's that Mrs. Bennet has nothing else to do. And so this is her goal in life, is to get all of her daughters married. And she goes to all lengths to make sure it happens. But in any case, so basically you have this exchange. She's trying to get him to go visit Mr. Bennet or Mr. Bingley, and she never really, he never really gives her an answer. And then you get like a quick idea that Mr. Bennet favors Lizzie over the rest of the daughters, and he actually says that she has
why?
quickness. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, I interrupted you. I was going to say Lizzie's woke too.
Yeah, Lizzie is definitely woke as well.
They like recognizes like.
Exactly, and they are a lot alike, Lizzie and Mr. Bennet. Although she's not quite as sardonic as he is, and she's a little bit kinder. But he says that Lizzie has a little bit more quickness to her. Then we get this. And then we get another good summary of the two, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, of their characters and how they interact with each other, and kind of how the roles that they play throughout the rest of the book. Mr. Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick heart, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice that the experience of 23 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character. Her mind was less difficult to develop. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its solace was visiting and news. And so that's all. That's pretty much. She's a superficial character, Mrs. Bennet is, whereas Mr. Bennet is an intelligent, woke feller. Okay, and so that brings us to chapter 2. And chapter 2, we have the whole family kind of sitting together, and Mr. Bennet continues to kind of mess with Mrs. Bennet about visiting Mr. Bingley. And at the end of the chapter, he finally says that he's visited Mr. Bingley, and again, like I said, this is and they talk about a ball coming up at the assembly room. A ball at a person's house. Not every house was large enough to accommodate a ball. Mr. Bennet's house is likely not. Netherfield, where Mr. Bingley lives, is. Many of the houses in this neighborhood are going to be too small to accommodate a ball, and so they have balls at the assembly room, which would have been above an inn. Like most of these little towns had like one assembly room where all the society in town would gather and have dances and meetings and things like that. And that's what they were talking about here, is there's going to be a ball at the assembly room. And that was considered lower class than having a ball at a home. And so you kind of see that clearly when the sisters, when Mr. Bingley and his sisters and Mr. Darcy come into the assembly room later. They kind of look down their noses at it. But they're about to have the ball at the assembly room, and Mr. Bennet finally admits, after he's messed with his wife a little bit, that he's gone and talked to Mr. Bingley, and now they're going to be able to talk to him and meet him. And that's pretty much all of chapter 2. And it does give you a nice little picture of the family together. In chapter 3, the girls go and visit Lady Lucas. And we get Sir William and Lady Lucas. Okay, they are not gentry. They are trade, but Mr. Lucas made a lot of money, and he was given a knighthood because he was the mayor of the Meryton, the town nearby, and he apparently did a very good job, and so he was given a knighthood. And this kind of went to his head. So he gives up his shop where he was working, decides he doesn't like working anymore, and they moved into this nice manor home that he calls Lucas Lodge. And he has a wife and a daughter, Charlotte, and I believe he's got a couple of brothers and a sister. And so Mrs. Bennet and the girls go and visit Lady Lucas, and Charlotte's there. And we get a little bit from Charlotte here too, but because the father is not giving the girls, Mr. Bennet's not giving the girls a very good description of Mr. Bingley, and it's really frustrating them. It's like, why you're not telling us what he's like? What is he like? Is he good looking? And he's not telling them anything because, he loves messing with them. But Lady Lucas tells them about Mr. Bingley, and apparently she hasn't met him yet, but her husband has, and her husband has given her a description. And the description of Mr. Bingley that we're given is this. Mr. Bingley was good looking and gentlemanlike. He had a pleasant countenance and easy, unaffected manners. His sisters were fine women with an air of decided fashion. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, merely looked the gentleman, but his friend, Mr. Darcy, soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person. This is actually them walking into the ball, excuse me. Okay. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. I'm sorry.
That's fine. That's fine.
I got behind, actually. Sorry, guys. Okay, that's right. Okay, first, Mr. Bingley comes and visits Mr. Bennet, and the girls don't see him. Well, they see him from the window, but he only visits Mr. Bennet in his library, and then he leaves. And that's generally how it went. As Mr. Bennet paid the call, Mr. Bingley returns the call, and then Mr. Bingley was invited to dinner. Mr. Bingley could not come to dinner because he was going to London. Anytime in any Jane Austen book or any book from this period, you read he has gone to town or she is in town. That means London. So Mr. Bingley had to go to London, so he can't come to dinner. And of course, Mrs. Bennet is utterly affronted by this. It's like, why in the world would he go to London? But we find out it was to bring some friends to stay with him and his sisters. And then we come to the assembly, the ball at the assembly room in Meryton. And Mr. Luke and Sir William Lucas has given this ball. And the primary object, most certainly, is to welcome Mr. Bingley, although it's probably not you know, advertised, but that's the real reason for it.
Also an awesome time to show off your sick dance moves.
Yeah. Yeah, there are lots of sick dance moves.
Oh man, the dance scenes in the miniseries have my jaw on the floor.
Yeah, they're busting a move, right, dude?
Yeah.
I have actually, like, a lot of square dances are based on these dances from the Regency era.
Really?
And I remember doing the Virginia Reel, and the first time I saw one of these movies, I was like, dude, that's the Virginia Reel.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Because when I was in middle school, we always took square dancing, was part of PE. Don't ask me why, but it was.
Same here.
Anyway, but in any case, they're at the ball in the assembly, and they're doing their sick dance moves, busting a move, and in comes Mr. Bingley and his party. And here is how Mr. Bingley and his people are described. Mr. Bingley was good-looking and gentlemanlike. He had a pleasant countenance and easy, unaffected manners. His sisters were fine women, with an air of decided fashion. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, merely looked the gentleman, but his friend, Mr. Darcy, soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person, handsome features, noble mien, and the report, which was in general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance, of his having 10,000 a year. The gentlemen pronounced him to be a fine figure of a man. The ladies declared he was much handsomer than Mr. Bingley, and he was looked at with great admiration for about half the evening, till his manners gave a disgust which turned the tide of his popularity. For he was discovered to be proud, to be above his company, and above being pleased. And not all his large estate in Derbyshire could then save him from having a most forbidding, disagreeable countenance, and being unworthy to be compared with his friend. You see how it works here. They find out he's rich. Oh my goodness, he is so handsome, and he's a great, he's a marvelous man. But then he kind of turns out to be kind of sullen and quiet and kind of proud, and they're like, oh, he's not that good looking, and oh, he's not that nice, he's not that good a guy. Yeah, that's how everything works, even these days.
Oh, Jennifer, you'll never find anyone like that in your everyday experience. But let me ask you a question. How do the economics of this situation work?
How do you?
So when they say he has $10,000 a year, are these all just like inheritances, or are these all like trust funds? What's going on here?
Well, it's inheritance, but it's inherited land, and on this land, on their estates, these gentlemen had tenants that would pay them rents, or they would pay him, or he would be given a share of the crops, or a share of the cattle that was sold, or all of that. And so 10,000 a year means that his estate yields $10,000 a year.
So what were the expectations for men in this particular segment of society? How were they to spend their days?
Back in a landed gentleman, he was supposed to look after his tenants and take care of the household until he finds a wife, and then the wife takes care of the household. But they don't really do anything except look after the tenants and the crops and everything that's going on their estate. But the thing is that most of these men had a steward, and the stewards were basically their right hand, like a manager of like a store or something. Think of it in that way. Like you have the owner of the franchise, and then you have the manager of the franchise. The gentleman was the owner of the franchise. The steward was the manager. And so most of the time, all that the gentleman did was, if there was a particular problem that the steward couldn't handle, the the gentleman would take care of it or help the steward take care of it. But most of the time, the steward ran everything. And but in other of Jane Austen's books, and like even in Jane Eyre, you see a distinction between a kind of a useless gentleman and a more um, involved owner of the property.
Yeah, you talk about like who's who in this thing, and I'm also very curious where education enters into this. Like, what level of education the men have in this segment of society,
most
how autodidactic they are too.
Well, most gentlemen at this time would have been brought up with a tutor until they were college age, and then they would go to Cambridge or Oxford or one of the main universities. They did receive an education, most of these men who were landed gentry. Some of them had tutors at home when they're children. Some of them were sent to school when they're children. It just really depended on money, and like the richest families usually had a tutor.
What do we know about the educational backgrounds of Darcy and Bingley?
Well, I think later
because
on,
Darcy's a very well-read man, right?
Yeah, and that as far as being autodidactic, you like some gentlemen probably would have some gentlemen weren't readers, and some gentlemen, it's just like people are today. Like some people finish their educations and they think they're done,
right?
And some people finish their educations and realize there's more they need to know. And Darcy is the kind of person that apparently I think we find out later that he went to Cambridge. And we find out too that Darcy is a great reader. He reads a lot. He like Bingley actually talks about his library at Pemberley, about how he keeps adding to it, and it's so large, and Darcy keeps adding to it, and he's always buying books. Whereas Bingley says that, oh well, actually Caroline Bingley, his sister, says, "Oh, I hate that our father didn't leave you more books." And Bingley's like, "Well, I don't read a whole lot anyway." And so they both would have been educated. Darcy probably went to a finer college than Mr. Bingley, but Mr. Bingley likely would have gone to college too. He just would have gone to a lesser college than like a Cambridge or Oxford.
Cool. All right. So yeah, proceed. Sorry for the interruption.
Okay, that's all right. So let's see. All right, so we find out that everybody loves Darcy when they find out he's rich, and then they don't like him when they find out he's proud. And then Mr. Bingley had soon made himself acquainted with all the principals.
I'm gonna interrupt you again. I'm sorry. Can you elaborate on this pride that Darcy has? Because it's a pretty important feature. Do you want to save that for later?
Well, it's kind of
why is it such a turnoff? Can you describe it a little bit more?
Like a little bit later on, I say Mrs. Bennet is talking to, I think it's either Lady Lucas or somebody else, but they talk about how he sat next to Mrs. Long for 10 minutes but didn't say anything to her. And when she talked to him, it was pretty obvious that he didn't want to talk to her. And the pride thing would have been, it's one of those things that you can sense about people sometimes, is when somebody walks into the room and like they seem to be, they're not smiling, they're not talking to anybody, they're trying to avoid certain people. They're like Mr. Darcy only dances with the people he's with. That would have been considered prideful, and that's looked down upon because society likes a good open character. Society likes extroverted people. society looks at introverted people and feel like they're not talking because you're not worthy to talk to. And that's what these people are seeing, is they feel like Mr. Darcy's looking down at them because he's not talking to anybody, because he's only dancing with who he came with, and they know that he's rich, and so it must be this pride thing that's making him not talk to anybody. And because he's not trying to engage with the rest of the town, he's seen as being proud, and that is a negative thing. So does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, I think so.
But yeah, it's like being snooty. You know, most of the time people look down on people who are snooty or conceited, and that's what's going on here. Is they think that he's snooty or conceited.
But he's not totally self-obsessed. There's much more complex than that.
Well, he is. And he kind of is, and he even admits to it near the end of the novel. That he is a little bit conceited and arrogant, but that doesn't make him a bad person, though, because he's actually a very good master. The housekeeper says he's a very good friend. He does the right thing. He does the honorable thing. And so nobody sees that, though. They only see this pride, this conceit. And also, I think it and he says later on, I don't have the talent of conversing with people I don't know. That's an introvert. He's an introvert. And that's something that didn't exist in the vernacular back in those days. And only in recent years have people begun to kind of see a difference between introverts and extroverts, and only in even more recent years have people begun to kind of understand that introverts aren't proud. They just don't want to talk. They just don't have that talent. And that's kind of a personal thing for me, because I'm an introvert. And
once you get you going.
Huh?
Once you get you going, you have a lot to say.
I'm sorry. But
no, you don't have to apologize. It makes my job a lot easier. Yeah, I appreciate it.
But yeah, I think that's really what it is Mr. Darcy's just an introvert. And yeah, he thinks highly of himself, but you know, but in any case, all right, Mr. Bingley had soon made himself acquainted with all the principal people in the room. And again, this is a good illustration of the difference between the two here. He was lively and unreserved, danced every dance, was angry that the ball closed so early, and talked of giving one himself at Netherfield. Such amiable qualities must speak for themselves. What a contrast between him and his friend. Mr. Darcy danced only once with Mrs. Hurst, and once with Miss Bingley, declined being introduced to any other lady, and spent the rest of the evening in walking about the room, speaking occasionally to one of his own party. His character was decided. He was the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world, and everybody hoped that he would never come there again. Amongst the most violent against him was Mrs. Bennet. His dislike of his general behavior was sharpened into particular resentment by his having slighted one of her daughters. And this is a big thing here, too. So Bingley comes up to Darcy and says, come on, man, come and dance with one of these girls. They're really pretty. They're really nice. All these people are really nice. Why aren't you dancing with anybody? Why aren't you talking to anybody? And Bingley's like come on, bro. Get into it, And Darcy's like, yeah. And Darcy's like, dude, no. And he, one of his very famous lines is, at an assembly such as this. And like I said, a ball given in an assembly room, and in the country, whereas Darcy would have been used to much more prim and proper and elegant balls than what they're having here at Meryton, probably. He is looking down on it. a little bit. He says, an assembly such as this is like, these are all kind of like country bumpkins compared to what he's used to. And so, and so Darcy says, no, I'm not going to dance with I mean, your sisters are dancing right now, and it would be a punishment to stand up with any other woman in the room, he says. And Bingley's like, dude, that's not even fair. Like, you know, there's some of these women are really pretty, and he's looking at Jane. And Darcy concedes, he's like, you're dancing with the only handsome woman in the room. It would be basically, he says, it would be an insult to stand up with anybody else. And Bingley's like, is just kind of is like, oh yeah, she's so pretty, she's so sweet, and everything. And then he sees Lizzie sitting by herself. Now Lizzie's not dancing because there aren't a lot of men at a ball, and at the ball, a lot of young men who are going to dance. And so if a woman doesn't have a partner, she doesn't dance. And so she just kind of sits by herself. And Lizzie doesn't have a partner. And Bingley sees her. And he says, well, look, there's one of her sisters. She's really pretty. Why don't you dance with her? And again, this is another famous line from Mr. Darcy. Darcy says, she is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. And I'm in no humor at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men. You had better return to your partner and enjoy her smiles, for you are wasting your time with me. And
so cold.
Yeah, it is. And again, this is another part of the genius of this book, is that even the reader doesn't like Darcy at first, because she paints him as this really kind of cold dude who just cannot be pleased with his company, and he's looking down on everything. And so we don't even know anything about him at this point, except that he's kind of a jerk, you know. And so in any case, and so Lizzie has heard this. Lizzie hears him say this, and that would have been considered, and that would have been considered a slight or a snub. And so that was pretty grim to get that. But that's pretty much the end of it. And we find out that Mr. Bingley danced with pretty much all the sisters. He danced with Jane, I think, twice or three times. Oh, he danced with her twice. Okay, and we find all this out when Okay, and then let's just do like a real quick here with Catherine and Lydia, Kitty and Lydia. There's a really quick little hint of their characters here. Catherine and Lydia had been fortunate enough to be never without partners, which was all that they had yet learnt to care for at a ball. So Kitty and Lydia are kind of like their mother, kind of airheaded. And so they come home, and Mrs. Bennet and Mr. Bennet's still awake, and Mrs. Bennet tries to tell Mr. Bennet about everything, and he's just like, don't even tell me. I don't want to hear about lace. I don't want. And you know, if Mr. Bingley had any compassion for me, he would have sprained his ankle in the first dance, because she keeps trying to tell him who all he danced with. And so Mr. Bennet basically shuts her down, and then she tells him about Mr. Darcy, and she says, okay, shocking rudeness of Mr. Darcy, but I can assure you, she added, that Lizzie does not lose much by not suiting his fancy, for he is a most disagreeable, horrid man, not at all worth pleasing, so high and so conceited that there was no enduring him. He walked here and he walked there, fancying himself so very great. Not handsome enough to dance with. I wish you had been there, my dear, to have given him one of your set downs. I quite detest the man. So that's the end of chapter 3. And poor Lizzie, bless her heart, she gets she gets refused by Mr. Darcy, and Mrs. Bennet is all in a rage about it. And that's where we leave off at the assembly. And then the next day, we get a little bit, actually, after, I think it's that same night, Lizzie and Jane kind of get together and talk, and we get a little idea of we get a little bit of an idea about the dynamic between the sisters, Jane and Lizzie. Jane and Lizzie are certainly the most admirable of the five daughters as far as their characters are concerned. They're both very much more sensible than the other three. And let me see where am I? Okay, yeah. And so we get a little bit of sense of Jane's character. Jane is very gracious, and Jane is very gracious and and really humble, and she's considered the most beautiful of all the sisters. But she's really humble about it. Like she's it's like a lot of men like to say. It's like, oh, she's so beautiful, and she has no idea that she is. That's Jane. And she's also very gracious, and she's very forgiving of people. Like, she doesn't like to see fault in anybody, and she's got a really sweet disposition. Whereas Lizzie, it's not that she's necessarily mean or anything or bad tempered. It's just that Lizzie is a little bit wiser and a little bit more shrewd, and she can see through the BS that Jane can't see through. And so Lizzie's a little bit more, what's the word? A little bit more cynical than Jane is. And so we get this little conversation between them, and Jane talks about how much she likes Mr. Bingley and how sweet he is. And then they start talking about the sisters, which we get a pretty good idea of their character here in a minute. So we'll take a break. Yeah. Do we need?
Well, yeah. Let's bring this session to a close here soon.
Oh, okay. Are we? Okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, you're doing great.
I didn't understand what was going on, but I'll just get real quickly get through this bit about the sisters, about the Bingley sisters.
Please do.
Okay. So Jane is saying, oh, well, they seemed really proud and haughty at first, but, they kind of improved on me, and they were actually really sweet and nice to me. And Elizabeth is just not buying it. Elizabeth says they were rather handsome, had been educated in one of the first private seminaries in town, had a fortune of £20,000, were in the habit of spending more than they ought, and of associating with people of rank, and were therefore in every respect entitled to think well of themselves, and meanly of others. They were of a respectable family in the north of England, a circumstance more deeply impressed on their memories than that their brother's fortune and their own had been acquired by trade. So the sisters are very haughty. They're really fine and elegant, and they look down on everybody. But here's the irony in this, is their fortune had been acquired by trade. That means that they're not a landed family. They're not landed gentry. And for all intents and purposes, the Longbourn family, the Bennets, would have been of higher rank than the Bingleys. But they didn't have any money. The Bennets don't, and the Bingleys do. And this is where money and rank begin to really flip-flop in English society. But the great injustice here is that later on they talk Mr. Bingley out of marrying Jane because she has an uncle in trade, which is exactly how they got their fortune. And so they look down on her. And so the way, and we all know people like this, who who have become so full of themselves that they forget where they're from, and they look down on people who are from the exact same place. And that's kind of how the sisters are. And they're really sweet to Jane, and so Jane is fine with them. But again, Lizzie kind of sees this hypocrisy in them that Jane does not. So let's just leave it at that. And that's actually not quite the end of chapter 4, but there's a little bit about Bingley and Darcy we need to talk about. It's going to take us a while, so let's just leave it there.
All right. Well, I want to thank you, Jennifer. Sorry I could go all night doing this, but unfortunately, I've got to move on to other projects. But I think we made a good crack at it.
Okay.
I think we got a good head of steam here, and hopefully that momentum will carry over into next week's session. So, very much appreciate you walking us through the interest, the importance of this book, and answering my random questions along the way.
Well, thank you.
So, all right. You have a wonderful evening. Okay.
You too.